The wind didn't just howl across the Mia, it screamed. It tore at the fabric of the sky, a sound as sharp and raw as the baby's cry. The baby was alive, sharp, shrill, impossibly alive. But its mother wasn't. She was face down in the dust, her dress a dark, spreading stain of blood, her hands slack and empty. One hand was still reaching, frozen in the last desperate gesture toward the bundle she'd barely glimpsed before the world went black. The others were long gone. Riders who hadn't waited for death to finish its work, their hoofbeats already swallowed by the plains. Above, buzzards circled, their shadows gliding over the scene, low and bold, impatient. They knew the scent of endings. And that's when he stepped from the shadows of the rock formations. He moved like a piece of the landscape detaching itself from the earth. Paint was smeared across his chest in patterns of war and grief, and a bone knife was tucked at his hip. His eyes, dark as gathering storm clouds, locked onto her body. Then they moved to the child. A flicker of something unreadable passed over his face. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. He just moved, fast and sure, not toward the dead, but toward the life that cried out against the silence. If you think you know how this story ends, you're wrong. Subscribe now, because the truth I'm about to tell you will haunt you in ways you can't imagine. But before we see what that lone warrior does next, let me take you back to the day it all began. The day the silence in Dry Creek was finally broken. The town of Dry Creek wasn't on any map that mattered. It was a sagging line of buildings clinging to a sun-baked road like loose teeth in an old man's jaw. Crooked, yellowed, and on the verge of falling out completely. The dust here didn't just settle, it was an active ingredient in the air. It coated windows with a gritty film, it lined the lungs of everyone who lived there, and it filled the oppressive silence that hung heavier than the relentless, baking heat. And silence was something Mercy knew better than anyone. They called her Mercy, though no one really remembered why. It was a cruel joke, a name whispered with a sneer. Perhaps her mother, long gone, had hoped she'd be spared the cruelty of the world. If so, that hope had dried up and blown away with the dust. Mercy had been an outcast in Dry Creek since the day she stopped being someone's wife and started being someone's warning. A cautionary tale told to children to make them behave. Her little house stood at the very edge of town, a place of deliberate exile. It was past the stables, just before the red earth cracked open and dropped off into canyons and vulture-haunted cliffs. The house itself was a testament to her status, a one-room shack with a crooked door that never quite closed and a window that never quite shut, letting in the dust and the whispers. Most nights, she sat by that window and watched the town lights flicker and die, one by one. Each extinguished lamp was a reminder of a home she wasn't welcome in, a community that had excised her like a tumor. Nobody ever waved. Nobody ever came to visit. The rumors had done their work long ago, poisoning the well of human kindness so thoroughly that no one dared to drink from it. She's got death trailing her like a shadow. Folks whispered over their beers in the saloon, their voices low and certain. Saw her talking to the wind once, I swear it, another would add, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid excitement. That limp ain't from no accident. Something dark took a piece of her, and it wants the rest. They weren't entirely wrong. Mercy walked with a slow, dragging step, a permanent hesitation in her gait. Her right leg was bent just enough to mark her as different, as damaged. The scar on her jaw didn't help either. It was a pale pink gash that curled up toward her ear like a smile gone terribly wrong, a permanent mark of violence. But it was her silence that bothered people the most. She didn't speak much, and when she did, her voice came out soft and crooked, a fragile thing that sounded like it didn't belong to her anymore. It was as if the fire had burned her voice box too. Some said she'd gone deaf after the fire. Others said she'd simply gone mad. Both theories held a sliver of truth. The fire had taken everything. It had taken her husband John, a man whose laugh she was starting to forget. Their small cabin had gone up in the middle of the night, a sudden, violent explosion of flame. There was no warning, no time to think, no way out. She had crawled from the inferno alone, burned and gasping for air, her lungs full of smoke and ash. Her belly was already swollen with the child who would now never meet his father. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain and feverish dreams. Ash, so much ash. The scent of burnt pine was permanently etched into her memory. There was a funeral, a somber affair she didn't attend. She couldn't. How could she stand there and listen to the preacher talk about God's will when she felt the devil's breath on her neck? After that, people didn't know what to do with her. So, they decided to do nothing at all. Her grief was too big, too ugly. It was a mirror, and they didn't like the reflection of their own fear and helplessness. The preacher came to her shack once, his Bible held like a shield. He spoke of moving on, of letting go, of accepting the Lord's mysterious ways. Mercy just stared at him, her eyes empty and hollow, until his words dried up in his throat. He left without another word, his polished boots kicking up dust. The next Sunday, from his pulpit, he didn't mention her name at all. She had been officially erased. Even the children, who usually possessed a thoughtless cruelty, learned to keep their distance. They had once dared each other to toss rocks onto her porch steps, hoping to get a reaction. She had opened the door and just looked at them, not angry, not sad, just hollow. That was worse than any scolding. The emptiness in her eyes scared them more than any ghost story. They never came back. The only sounds in her life were the ceaseless wind and the faint trickle of the creek that was slowly dying, just like the town's compassion. She kept to herself, mending torn clothes for a few pennies, patching the endless leaks in her roof, and waiting. Waiting for what? She wasn't sure. Maybe for the end. Maybe for a beginning. Then the letters started. They began showing up 2 weeks before her due date, when her body was heavy and her spirit was at its lowest. They were always folded into a tight, small square and tucked beneath her door in the dead of night. There was never a name, never a hint of who sent them. Just words, sharp and cold as a razor. The first one said simply, "I know what they did." The words sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Who were they? What did they do? Was it about the shunning? Or something else? Something worse? She burned the note in her small fireplace, watching the paper curl into black ash, but the words were branded onto her mind. A few nights later, a second one appeared. He wasn't alone in that cabin. This time, she couldn't breathe. John, not alone. The official story was that he'd been asleep, that he never woke up. But this letter suggested something else entirely, a secret, a betrayal, a murder. The fire was no accident. The thought was so monstrous, so terrifying, that she almost fainted. The town hadn't just abandoned her after the tragedy. They had caused it. The third letter was the most chilling of all. "They'll come for you next." She didn't tell anyone. Who was there to tell? The sheriff, a man who tipped his hat to the preacher and spat when she walked by. The blacksmith, who had stopped selling her nails. There was no one, so she burned the notes one by one and tried to pretend they didn't exist. She tried to convince herself it was a cruel prank, someone's sick idea of a joke. But the fear took root. At night, she started hearing things. Hoofbeats in the distance that she couldn't quite place. The crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading to her house. Footsteps that always stopped just before reaching her porch, as if the person lost their nerve, or was simply enjoying her terror. Sometimes she'd wake up with the suffocating feeling that someone had been in the room with her. Someone standing over her bed, close enough to touch, but far too cruel to ever help. If your heart is already breaking for her, you need to brace yourself. You haven't seen the worst of it yet. Not even close. Tap that subscribe button, because what I have to tell you next will change everything you think you know about human nature. Even with the mounting fear, the loneliness remained the sharpest pain. Loneliness was its own special kind of cruelty. It was slow, relentless, and polite enough to knock before it came inside and devoured you whole. She took to walking along the edge of town at dusk, not to go anywhere, but just to feel the illusion of other people nearby. The distant sounds of a piano from the saloon, the faint smell of cooking fires, the silhouette of a family in a lighted window. They were ghosts of a life she could never have, but it was better than the crushing emptiness of her shack. Nobody ever greeted her on these walks. They'd cross the street to avoid her, their faces hardening into masks of contempt. Mothers would pull their children close, whispering warnings. Men would stop talking and just stare, their eyes following her until she was out of sight. And still, she walked. Maybe because the ache in her legs from her limp was a welcome distraction from the permanent grinding ache in her chest. By the 9th month, the pain started coming in waves. At first, she thought it was just the baby turning, pressing, getting ready. But this felt different. It was lower, heavier, a twisting, tearing sensation, like her bones were being ground into dust from the inside. Labor. It was time. Panic seized her. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help. Swallowing her pride, which was all she had left, she stumbled through the town to the doctor's house. She knocked on the door, her knuckles trembling. It was the doctor's wife who answered, a woman known for her piety and her prize-winning pies. She took one look at Mercy, clutching her swollen belly, her face pale with pain, and her expression curdled. She clutched the Bible she was holding to her chest like a shield. "We're not involved," the woman said, her voice as cold and hard as a river stone. "And neither should you be." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. The meaning was clear. "You are not one of us. Your problems are not our problems. Go away and die." Mercy stood on that porch for a full minute, the woman's words echoing in the space between her labor pains. Then, with a dignity she didn't know she possessed, she turned around and walked away. She gave birth alone, on the dirt floor of her own miserable shack. But that's not the part that hurts the most. The part that hurts is this. She screamed for help when the worst of it began. She screamed until her throat was torn raw, her voice a shredded ruin. She screamed for the doctor, for the preacher's wife, for anyone. Her screams echoed through the silent, dusty streets of Dry Creek, and in response, every window stayed dark. Every door stayed shut. The whole town held its breath and pretended not to hear the agony of the woman they had cast out. And the last thing Mercy saw before the pain and blood loss finally dragged her into unconsciousness was a shadow. The distinct shadow of a rider, sitting on his horse at the edge of the canyon, watching her little shack. Not helping, not leaving, just watching. Before we dive back into this story, just a quick note. I'm Emma Tone, the voice behind this narration. If you're enjoying the way this story sounds, let me know in the comments. Your feedback helps us decide if we should keep the same voice for future videos. Now, let's get back to Mercy. The bleeding finally stopped 2 days after they left her for dead. By all rights, that alone should have killed her. The loss of blood, the shock, the exposure. But something stronger than death, something hard and stubborn. Maybe it was spite. Maybe it was a mother's instinct, kept her clinging to this world by a single frayed thread. She didn't remember much of that night. It was a chaotic slideshow of terrifying images, the sound of hooves, not just one rider, but several. A soft, cruel grunt of effort, a sharp pain in her head, and then a strange warmth against her back when everything else in the world had gone cold and dark. She woke to the smell of juniper smoke and rawhide. It was a clean, sharp scent, so different from the perpetual dust of Dry Creek. At first, she thought she'd crossed over to the other side. The sky was wrong. It was a deeper, more brilliant blue than she had ever seen, filtered through a canopy of pine needles instead of a film of grit. She wasn't in Dry Creek anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere beyond. Then she heard it, breathing, not her own ragged gasps, but the steady, controlled breathing of someone else, someone who was watching her. She turned her head slowly, every joint in her body screaming in protest. A man sat by a small, smokeless fire, sharpening a piece of bone. It wasn't a knife exactly, but something older, more primal. His eyes flicked to hers the moment she moved. He wasn't startled. He wasn't even particularly curious. He was just present. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, and his black hair hung loose around his shoulders. Apache. The word formed in her mind, thick with all the terrifying stories she'd heard as a child. That they could vanish into solid rock, that they could track the path of the wind, that they slit throats in the dark without making a sound. But this man didn't look like a ghost or a monster from a campfire story. He looked like someone who had seen too much of the world's cruelty to be afraid of it anymore. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't offer his. Instead, he rose, filled a leather pouch with water from a nearby stream, and handed it to her. His movements were economical and precise. He then tore a strip of clean cloth from his own belongings and began to gently clean the dried blood from her hands and face. She watched him work, dazed and half-dreaming, a part of her still convinced this was some kind of fever-induced hallucination. She noticed a scar across his brow, a thin, silver ribbon of skin that looked as if something had once tried to split his skull open and failed. They didn't speak a word to each other that first day. They didn't have to. Words would have felt loud and clumsy, an intrusion on the fragile peace of the moment. Words would have broken something. Mercy drank the water, and then she slept, a deep, healing sleep, unlike any she had known in years. When she woke again, the sun was lower in the sky, and something was nestled beside her. She looked down, and her breath caught in her throat. It was her baby, swaddled tightly in soft, clean deerskin, his tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of life. He was breathing. He was alive. She cried then. For the first time since the fire that had taken her husband, she truly cried. Not silent, choked sobs of despair, but loud, wrenching tears of grief and gratitude and 100 other emotions she couldn't name. The Apache man sat by the fire, his back to her, giving her the space to let it all out. On the third night, she was stronger, strong enough to sit upright, even though every muscle ached, strong enough to face the man who had saved her. They sat across the small fire from each other, the flames dancing between them. "You should have left me," she said, her voice cracking from disuse. It was the first thing she had said to him. He didn't look away from the fire. His profile was stark and unyielding in the flickering light. "You weren't dead," he replied simply. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It felt earned. It was a silence built on shared space and unspoken understanding. She studied his hands as he tended to the fire. They were steady, scarred, and skilled. "Why help me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind. A white woman, an outcast. Helping her was a risk, a huge risk. He paused in his task, his gaze distant. When he finally answered, his voice was low and heavy with memory. "I buried a wife once," he said. "She was pregnant." Mercy didn't ask for more details. She didn't need to. Some grief is a universal language. It doesn't need to be explained or translated. She understood. In that moment, he was no longer a mysterious, frightening Apache warrior. He was a man who knew her specific brand of pain. She didn't ask about his tribe or his name, or why he had risked everything to pull her from that dusty patch of earth when her own people had turned their backs. Instead, she found herself telling him everything. She told him about the town, about the shunning, about the fire, and she told him about the letters, about the fear that had been her constant companion for weeks. She told him about the way they'd looked at her, with accusation in their eyes, as if she'd been the one to light the match that killed her own husband. When she was finished, her story hanging in the cool night air between them, he finally looked at her. His dark eyes seemed to see right through her, down to the bone. "You still trust too much," he said. She let out a short, bitter laugh. "I don't trust anything anymore." He just gave her a long, slow look, as if he knew better, as if somehow he could see a strength in her that she couldn't see in herself. And for the first time in months, maybe even years, Mercy didn't feel broken. She just felt unfinished, like a story that wasn't over yet. They moved camp on the 5th day. He never explained why, but Mercy was starting to learn how to read his silences. She saw the signs. He kept scanning the ridgeline, his body tense. He would pause for long moments, listening to the wind, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. He would vanish for hours on scouting missions and return with a rabbit or a quail for their meal, but his face would be drawn and tight. One morning, she woke to find him packing their few belongings with a silent urgency. "What is it?" she asked, her heart starting to beat a little faster. He gestured with his chin towards the south, back in the direction of her old life. "Smoke," he said, just that one word. Her heart sank. Dry Creek. He wouldn't say if he thought they were looking for her, but she knew. The threat from the letters, "They'll come for you next," echoed in her mind. They hadn't been idle threats. The town wasn't content to simply cast her out. They wanted her gone. For good. That night, the lessons began. He didn't just teach her how to survive in the wilderness. He taught her how to be a ghost. He showed her how to move through dense trees without snapping a single twig. He taught her how to follow a water source uphill to find the cleaner, safer springs. He taught her how to read the clouds and the behavior of animals to predict the weather. And he taught her how to walk with a knife in her hand without looking like she had one, the weapon a natural extension of her body, hidden and ready. The baby, miraculously, never cried much. He was a quiet, watchful infant. Maybe he understood the danger, too. Maybe the silence of the wilderness was already a part of him. On the 10th night of their journey, they reached a high, wind-swept bluff that overlooked the entire valley. Below them, nestled in a dusty bowl, was Dry Creek. From this distance, it looked small and insignificant, like a child's toy town abandoned in a sandbox. The man she was with, her silent protector, stood beside her and watched it for a long, long time. The moonlight cast his face in profile, half in light, half in shadow, the secrets of his past tucked into the hard line of his jaw. "You going to go back?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Mercy's lips tightened into a thin line. The thought of that place, of those faces, filled her with a cold dread. "What for?" she asked, her own voice bitter. He turned to look at her then, his gaze intense. "To bury the part of you that still waits for them to change." His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. He saw it. He saw the tiny, foolish flicker of hope she still harbored, the part of her that couldn't believe people could be so cruel, the part that still, somewhere deep down, wanted their approval, their acceptance, the part of her that was still a victim. She looked at him, really looked at him, and whispered, "You see me different than they do." He nodded once, a small, sharp movement. "I see you." What if someone saw you for who you truly are, not for the baggage you carry or the scars you bear? What if they saw the fire inside you instead of the ashes? Subscribe. One day, that story might be yours too. Word travels, even on the silent currents of the wind. A trader, a fur trapper from downriver with loose lips and an eye for a quick coin, spotted them near a river bend. He saw a woman with a distinctive limp and a telltale scar on her jaw, traveling with an Apache warrior and a newborn. He didn't need a map to put the pieces together. He rode hard and fast, and the news he carried spread through Dry Creek like a plague. She's alive. And she ain't alone. That was all it took. The whispers in the saloon turned from morbid gossip to something harder, something more dangerous. By the end of the week, eyes narrowed whenever her name was spoken. The blacksmith wasn't just ignoring her anymore. He was actively loading his shotgun, his face a grim mask. The preacher, from his pulpit, stopped ignoring her existence and started speaking of unnatural alliances and the dangers of consorting with savages. "She's got an Apache protecting her now," someone hissed in the general store, the words thick with fear and resentment. "Or controlling her," someone else replied, planting a new, poisonous seed. "Mind-controlling, they say." But it wasn't just fear that was driving them. It was guilt, a deep, festering guilt that they couldn't admit to, even to themselves. They had left her. They had left a mother and her newborn child to die in the dirt. That kind of sin doesn't just go away. It ferments, it turns sour, and unless it can be buried, it will eventually consume you. So they found a way to bury it under something worse. Blame. They blamed her. Again. It was her fault for surviving, her fault for finding help, her fault for not having the decency to just disappear. A month passed, then two. The seasons began to turn. Mercy learned how to track deer scat and tell how fresh it was. She learned how to make a soothing salve from pine resin and herbs for the baby's rashes. She learned to read the shapes of the clouds the way some people read tea leaves. Her limp never faded, but it no longer defined her. Her body, once frail, grew strong again, hardened by labor and necessity. Her spirit, too, began to heal, though it didn't feel that way at first. It was a slow, painful knitting together of shattered pieces. She still cried sometimes, in the dead of night when the memories came for her. But now she cried with someone sitting beside her, a silent, steady presence by the fire. And that changed everything. The man, she still didn't know his name, carved her a bow from a strong, supple piece of yew wood. He taught her how to fletch arrows and how to notch the string, how to pull and breathe and release in one smooth, fluid motion. When she asked him why she needed to learn, he simply said, "In case I'm not there." The words hung in the air between them, a stark reminder that their time together was borrowed, and that danger was always just over the next ridge. They didn't talk about the future. That felt too dangerous, too fragile to be spoken aloud. But one night, after the baby had drifted to sleep in his makeshift cradle of soft furs, she did something brave. She reached across the small space between them, across the dancing flames of the fire, and placed her hand over his. He didn't flinch, he didn't pull away, he didn't speak. He just sat there, perfectly still, and let her touch him. Let her feel the warmth of his skin, the calloused strength of his hand. It was the first simple human touch she had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. And in that quiet, profound moment, Mercy knew that whatever came next, whatever horrors the world decided to throw at her, she wasn't going to face them alone anymore. They came at dawn, like cowards always do. Mercy had woken early that morning, long before the sun. She had been stirred by a strange shift in the wind. It had gone too still, too silent. Even the birds, usually a riot of chirping at this hour, held their breath. An unnatural quiet had fallen over the forest. She was halfway to the stream, the baby swaddled snugly against her chest, when she saw it. A glint of light where there should have been none. Sunlight catching on a polished rifle barrel. Then another, and another. 3 men stepped out from the dense tree line, their movements cautious but determined. They were town men, faces she knew too well. Eli Cormack, a rancher whose land bordered her old property. George, the stable hand, a man who had always been kind to her horses. And the preacher's son, his face a twisted mask of his father's self-righteous scowl. They stepped forward with their guns already drawn, pretending not to see the infant she held in her arms. "Don't move, Mercy," Eli said, his voice trying for steady, but she could hear the tremor in it. It was too calm. The calm of a man trying to convince himself he's doing the right thing. "We don't want the child." Mercy froze. For a second, her knees went weak, and she thought she might fall. But then a cold, hard anger rose up in her, and she stood her ground. "Back away from the camp," the preacher's son commanded, his voice sharp and full of authority he hadn't earned. "Hands where we can see them." She backed away slowly, deliberately shielding the baby with her body, turning him away from their guns. "Why?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. The preacher's son sneered, a truly ugly expression on his young face. "You made your choice, Mercy, sleeping with a savage, hiding out here like some kind of outlaw. That ain't the kind of mother Dry Creek wants coming back." "I didn't ask you to want me," she spat back, the words tasting like acid. "Didn't matter," he said, shaking his head with mock pity. "People got scared, said you were cursed, said it was time to fix what should have stayed dead." They had waited. The thought hit her with sickening clarity. They had waited until the Apache, her Apache, had gone off to hunt at dawn. They had been watching the camp. She realized it then. The trapper hadn't just been a rumor. Someone had told them where to find her. Someone who had seen their camp, recognized her face, and had gone running back to town with the secrets of her survival on their tongue. She had no time to fight, no time to plead. They were on her in an instant. Eli grabbed her arms while George, his face full of shame and his eyes refusing to meet hers, wrenched the crying baby from her grasp. The preacher's son knocked her to the ground with the butt of his rifle. They tied her wrists with a coarse rope that bit into her skin. "We'll bring the child back where it belongs," the preacher's son said, looking down at her with contempt. "To a good Christian home. We'll tell everyone the Apache killed you. You're lucky we don't leave you for the buzzards again." The last thing she saw before they dragged her away, stumbling and bleeding, was the fire still burning at the heart of their small camp. Unattended, abandoned, just like her heart, just like her life. They didn't kill her. They did something worse. They locked her in the church cellar. It was a cold, damp space with a packed dirt floor and a single high window that was boarded up, letting in no light. And no child. Her baby was gone. She screamed for hours, her voice echoing in the suffocating darkness. She beat her fists against the thick wooden door until they were bruised and bloody. When she had no strength left, she collapsed onto the damp earth and whispered lullabies to herself, to the ghost of the child they had stolen, until her throat gave out and she could make no sound at all. She lost all track of time. Day and night blended into one long, dark nightmare. She didn't know what day it was when she heard the faint creak of the cellar door opening above. She didn't even look up. She didn't have the strength or the will. Heavy boots stepped onto the stone steps leading down into the cellar. They stopped. Then she heard the softest sound. The whisper of leather touching skin. A hand, warm and real, touched her cheek. She flinched, expecting a blow. But the touch was gentle. She looked up, and through the grime and the tears, she saw him. Her Apache. He had come back. She broke then, not in fear but in a wave of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. "You came back," she rasped, her voice a barely audible croak. He didn't speak. He was not a man of useless words. He simply knelt, his dark eyes taking in her bruised face and bound wrists. He pulled out his knife and sliced through the ropes, then gently, as if she were something precious and not something broken and lost, he lifted her to her feet. "Just hurt," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He didn't carry her like some hero in a storybook. He helped her walk, supporting her weight as she staggered up the steps and out into the shocking brightness of the night. They moved through the edge of town in the deep darkness, staying to the shadows of the alleys and the thick brush. She couldn't stop shaking, a deep, violent tremor that came from her bones. "They took him," she whispered, the words tearing at her raw throat. The baby. They said, I know, he said softly. And there was something about the way he said it. Not panicked, not even angry, just a deep, steady certainty that wrapped itself around her shattered nerves like a warm blanket. They reached the edge of town, the last few buildings giving way to the open wilderness. And then the world tilted on its axis. Her body, pushed far beyond its limits, simply gave out. Her legs collapsed beneath her, and this time she didn't try to stop it. She sank into a patch of snow that lingered in the shadows, the cold a shocking, clean feeling against her feverish skin. Cold, soft, unforgiving. He didn't speak. He didn't try to pull her up. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her to get over it. He just sat down in the snow beside her and waited. He let the silence be, and in that shared silence, under the cold, indifferent stars, something inside her finally cracked open, not to break, but to heal. I was so sure they wouldn't come back, she said, her teeth chattering. After what they did, after what they saw me become. I thought maybe they'd just forget about me. Maybe I could start over and matter again, just not to them. He looked at her, his gaze steady. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no fear. He was just there. They were never going to see you, he said, his voice low and clear. They only see what scares them. She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. So, what does that make me? He leaned in, his face close to hers, his breath a small cloud in the frosty air. Something they will never understand, he said, and that scares the hell out of them. They slept under the trees that night. There was no fire, no food, just the frost gathering on their eyelashes and the shared warmth of their bodies. He kept one arm around her as she drifted in and out of a restless sleep, his presence more for comfort than for warmth. When she startled awake just before dawn, gasping from a nightmare, he didn't ask her why. He just pressed the handle of the knife she'd learned to use weeks before into her hand. She closed her fingers around the familiar worn wood. She understood the message. We go together now. Always. The child, her child, was being held by the preacher's wife. He was safe, for now. He was swaddled in a clean, white church blanket, his little face too quiet, too still. Mercy watched from the concealment of the trees at the edge of the churchyard, her blood boiling under her skin. The hypocrisy was staggering. They steal her son to give him a good, Christian home, the very same home that had turned her away when she was in labor. I want him back, she said. Her voice was flat, cold, and devoid of any emotion except a chilling resolve. We'll get him, the Apache replied, his eyes also fixed on the church. You don't have to do this, she said, turning to him. This isn't your fight. I do, he said simply. That was it. No grand declarations of love or loyalty. Just a quiet, unbreakable allegiance. A statement of fact. I do. They waited until nightfall, until the town was cloaked in darkness and false piety. She walked in first, alone. It had to be her. Her face was bare, her dark hair tangled and wild, a torn ribbon she'd found tied around her wrist like a defiant flag. She pushed open the heavy church doors and stepped inside. The preacher's wife gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The men who had stolen her son, Eli Cormack, the preacher's son, and a few others, were gathered there, as if for a vigil. They stood slowly from the pews, their hands drifting instinctively towards the weapons at their belts. You shouldn't be here, Eli said, his voice a low warning. I'm not staying, Mercy replied, her eyes scanning the room until she found him. The baby, resting in a makeshift cradle by the altar. He opened his eyes, as if sensing her presence. Then what do you want? The preacher's son demanded. I came to take back what's mine, she said. And at that exact moment, the stained glass window behind the altar shattered inwards, spraying colorful shards of glass across the floor. Her Apache stepped through the jagged opening, framed by the smoke and flame of a burning torch he'd tossed outside. He wasn't charging, he wasn't shouting, he was just present. A silent, terrifying judgment that had come to call. No blood was spilled that night. It wasn't necessary. Something else broke in Dry Creek instead. The town's smug certainty, their moral authority. A silence heavier than any stone settled in that room, thick with guilt and fear. And when Mercy walked to the altar, picked up her son, and held him tight against her chest, no one stopped her. No one even moved. They just watched her go, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight, the scent of smoke and shattered glass filling the holy space. They didn't go back to the old camp. They didn't go far either. Just far enough for the cold night air to feel clean, not cruel. Far enough to feel the rhythm of their own breath in the quiet of the trees. He set up a simple lean-to shelter while she sat and nursed her child, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. Her hands still shook, but not from fear anymore. It was from the release of it, from the overwhelming, dizzying belief that it might actually be over. Later that night, she sat beside him near a new fire, their knees touching, the silence between them easy and comfortable. "Why didn't you try to fix me?" she asked quietly, the question coming from a place deep inside her. He glanced at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "You weren't broken," he said. It was the simplest, most profound thing anyone had ever said to her. She smiled. A real one this time. A small, slow curve of her lips that reached her eyes. Then why stay? His answer was so simple, so direct, it stopped her heart for a beat. He looked from her to the sleeping baby, and then back to her. "Because I wanted to. Not because he pitied her, not because he saw her as some damsel in distress to be rescued, but because he saw her, all of her. The scars, the limp, the silence, the fire. And he chose to stay anyway. They thought she was broken, a cursed thing to be thrown away. But this man, this stranger, saw gold shimmering in the ashes. If you believe that love can still be found in the most hopeless of places, subscribe. I promise you, tomorrow's story will prove that miracles still happen out here in the wild. The fire was different now. It wasn't the wild, destructive blaze that had ruined her life. It wasn't the kind of inferno that swallowed walls and scorched skin. This fire was steady, controlled, contained. It danced quietly in the stone pit outside the little shack they had built with their own 4 hands. It had taken months of back-breaking work, but they had done it together. They had built a home, a one-room cabin nestled deep into the trees, the walls made from rough-cut pine logs and old straight nails he carried in a leather pouch, as if they were gold. Mercy, her hands growing stronger and more calloused by the day, had carved wooden shutters for the windows herself. He had built the roof one plank at a time, teaching her how to drive each nail with care and precision, not with anger. There was no sign to mark their home, no fence to keep the world out. Just a wide, peaceful stretch of land that felt like theirs. They had 2 horses, traded for with a bundle of cured furs and medicinal herbs. And there was a silence that felt sacred now, not like loneliness. It was peace. They had done the one thing the town of Dry Creek had said was impossible. They had survived. No, they had done more than that. They had started to live. Winter crept back into the mountains, slow and cold. Mercy chopped firewood, her bad leg braced, her shoulders stronger than they had ever been. Her hands cracked and bled in the cold, but they healed again, tougher than before. She found her voice again, singing softly to the baby, who was now a toddler, taking his first wobbly steps. Her voice was still quiet, but it was no longer afraid. He taught her how to set traps in the snow, how to read the subtle signs of animal tracks. She taught him how to make a hearty stew out of nearly nothing, some dried meat, wild roots, and a handful of herbs. They laughed now, real, deep-bellied laughs that echoed through the pines. Even that felt new and miraculous. But not everything was easy. The past had long claws. Sometimes, Mercy would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, her heart pounding. She was back in the cellar, her wrists bound, the smell of damp earth in her nostrils. She was back in the church, surrounded by the cold, judgmental faces of men she used to trust. He never asked what the dreams were about. He didn't need to. He would just hold her, his steady presence a silent anchor, and let her ride out the storm without trying to steer. And still, after all this time, after everything they had been through, he had never told her his name. It was a small, unopened box between them. The past arrived on a Tuesday. Mercy was outside, boiling herbs over the fire, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats, fast, steady, and familiar, military. She stood up, her body instantly tense. So did he. One rider. He wasn't wearing an official uniform, just a worn blue coat that marked him as former Union cavalry. He carried no rifle, no badge, just the weary authority of a man on a mission. He dismounted without a word and walked toward the cabin, his eyes fixed entirely on the Apache. Mercy quickly stepped between them, placing herself protectively in front of the man who had saved her. The rider stopped and tipped his hat to her, a gesture of polite respect that didn't reach his cool, appraising eyes. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his gaze flicking past her to the man behind her. The Apache didn't blink. He stood as still as a stone. "Didn't expect to be followed." Mercy's voice came out sharper than she intended. "Who is he?" she demanded of the rider. The rider looked at her then, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. "Lady," he said slowly, "you don't even know who you're lying next to at night?" "I know enough," she shot back. "No, ma'am, you don't," he said, his gaze shifting back to the silent man behind her. "This man, he walked away from blood, he walked away from his duty, he walked away from us." Mercy's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. "You left a war," the rider added, his voice laced with accusation. "But the war didn't leave you." The Apache said nothing. He just stared, his face an unreadable mask. After a long, tense silence, the rider spit into the dirt. "You're not done," he said, his voice a low growl. "The past, don't ever let you be done." Then he turned, swung himself back onto his horse, and rode off, a dark shadow cutting across the sunlit snow. They didn't talk about it for 2 whole days. Mercy didn't push. She knew he would speak when he was ready. But something inside her ached, a raw, familiar feeling. She had carried her own shame for so long, and he had helped her hold it without ever asking a question. Now, his own ghosts had come calling, and he was turning away from them like stone. Finally, one night, as the fire crackled and the baby slept soundly inside the cabin, he spoke. His voice was quiet, barely a whisper. "My name was Cale." She looked at him, waited. The past tense of the verb hung in the air. "I left," he continued, his eyes fixed on the flames, "because the war made me a man I didn't want to be. It taught me to kill without thinking, to hate without reason. But I can't undo the blood that's on my hands." She reached out and took his hand, her small, calloused palm covering his. "It doesn't matter to me," she said softly. "None of that matters. Not if you're still trying to build something instead of burn it all down." He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement. Then he added, his voice grim, "But they'll come back." "You mean more soldiers?" she asked, her heart sinking. "No," he said, finally turning to look at her, his dark eyes full of a terrible certainty. "The past, in boots and on horses, it always comes back. You've come this far with her. You felt that chill down your spine, didn't you? Subscribe, and I want you to meet someone else tomorrow. Someone just as forgotten and just as strong." The decision came a few days later. It was unexpected, but as clear and bright as the winter sun on fresh snow. A family wandered onto their land, half-starved and freezing. A widow, her 2 young boys, and a little girl too young to speak, her eyes wide with trauma. Their wagon had overturned in the frozen river bend, and they had lost everything. Mercy took one look at them and took them in without a moment's hesitation. Cale didn't argue. He wordlessly helped the woman and her children into the warmth of their small cabin. They fed them hot stew, dressed their wounds and frostbite, and when the snow began to fall heavily again that week, they let them stay. Something changed in that act of kindness. The small cabin was no longer just theirs. It had become a refuge, a sanctuary. Mercy watched Cale patiently teaching the 2 young boys how to track a deer in the snow. She watched the little girl, who hadn't spoken a word, start to cling to his knee, a silent trust forming between them. And she watched herself start to dream bigger than just mere survival. "We could build another one," she said one morning, as she and Cale stood outside watching the children play. Cale looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Another what?" "Another house," she said, a bold new idea taking shape in her mind. "For others. For the ones who've got nowhere else to go. The ones with names that are whispered in town like poison, like mine was." He looked at her, and a smile touched his lips. A rare, slow smile that transformed his weathered face. "You sure about that?" he asked. "No," she admitted, "but I want to try." And so they built. They didn't just build walls, they built a place. They built a ranch, a safe stretch of woods and water, a small, fiercely protected community of the outcast and the left behind. It wasn't many at first, just enough. But one by one, they came. A widower with a badly burned hand who couldn't find work. A young, half-black girl who had been run out of 2 different towns for the color of her skin. A boy who was too soft-spoken and gentle to belong anywhere in that harsh world. Mercy taught them how to boil pine sap to seal the roofs. Cale taught them how to listen to the wind. And always, at the center of their small, growing community, the fire burned bright. But peace doesn't stay quiet forever. Not in that world. One evening at dusk, riders appeared on the ridge overlooking their small settlement. 5 of them. They were townfolk, their silhouettes dark against the setting sun, guns on their hips, a cloud of dust in their wake. And riding at the front, his face a familiar mask of arrogant piety, was the preacher's son. He reined in his horse and called down to them, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can just hide all the sinners out here, Mercy?" Cale stepped forward, his body placing him between the riders and the families huddled behind him. "We don't hide," he called back, his voice calm and steady. "We live." The preacher's son sneered. "You don't get to build a new world just 'cause the old one didn't want you." Mercy stepped up to stand beside Cale, her voice ringing out clear and strong, with no trace of the fear that had once defined her. "We didn't ask for your permission." There was a long, tense pause. The air crackled with unspoken threats. Then, the preacher's son slowly raised his rifle, aiming it not at her, but at Cale. That's when Mercy moved faster than she ever thought she could. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for a weapon. She simply stepped directly in front of Cale, blocking him with her own body. She stared up at the preacher's son and said, her voice loud enough to shake the trees, "You'll have to shoot through me." The boy hesitated. He blinked, his certainty wavering for just a second. He looked at the woman he had once left for dead, a woman who was now willing to die for a man he called a savage. He saw the fire in her eyes, and it was a fire he could not quench. He lowered his gun just an inch. "This ain't over," he muttered, his threat sounding hollow and weak. "Maybe not," Mercy said, her voice unwavering, "but it's ours now." They never came back. Maybe it was because they were afraid, or maybe, just maybe, it was because they had finally seen what Mercy had truly become. Not a ghost, not a victim, but a fire, reborn from the ashes. That night, as the small community of the ranch gathered around their central fire, someone asked her, "Mercy, do you ever miss the town?" Mercy looked up at the vast expanse of brilliant, uncaring stars. "No," she said softly. "I remember it, but I don't miss it." And Cale, her Cale, reached out and took her hand. Together they watched the fire crackle and dance, and in its warm, golden glow, they saw a life that no one had given them, a life they had carved for themselves from stone and ash and silence, a life worth fighting for. They came to the edge of Dry Creek at dawn. Cale rode beside her, his presence a silent pillar of strength. The boy, their boy, slept peacefully in a sling against her chest, his tiny fingers curled around a pine needle as if it were a sword. Mercy didn't wear a dress, not the kind of dress the town's women would expect. She wore a thick wool coat she had stitched herself, a simple ribbon in her hair, and a fire in her chest that burned brighter than any sun. They didn't come to beg for forgiveness or acceptance. They came for a name. The town was quieter than she remembered. Smaller, somehow. The wood of the chapel looked warped and tired. The windows of the general store were shuttered, even though it was morning. The faces that peered out through curtains were the same familiar ones, but now they looked frightened, as if the past itself had come walking back down their main street. She stopped her horse in front of the chapel and just sat there, letting the silence gather like storm clouds. She waited, and eventually they came out to face her. The preacher, looking older and more stooped than she remembered. His son, his face pale and drawn. Eli Cormack and a few others. They looked like men haunted by their own ghosts. The preacher spoke first, his voice thin and reedy. "You're not welcome here, Mercy." "I'm not staying," she replied, her voice calm and even. "But my son was born under your sky, and he deserves to know where he comes from. He deserves a name in front of the people who cast his mother out." The preacher's eyes flicked nervously to Cale, then to the sleeping child on Mercy's chest. "You mean to bring shame on this town a second time?" Mercy swung her leg over and slid off her horse, standing before them on her own 2 feet. "I mean to bring the truth," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the morning chill. "You left me in the dirt to die. This man didn't. You tried to bury me and call it God's will. He helped me bloom." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. They weren't angry anymore. Not really. They just looked small and tired and afraid of the woman she had become. She looked to Cale. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. Then she turned her gaze back to the people who had once called her cursed, the people who had listened to her screams and done nothing. "This boy's name is Elijah," she announced, her voice full and strong. "Not because of any of you, but because I took something bitter and I made it sweet, because I took the ashes of my life and built a home. His name is Elijah, and he is not a curse. He is a promise." They didn't clap, they didn't cheer, but they didn't stop her either. They just stood there in the dust and watched as she and Cale turned their horses and rode away, and that was enough. Later that night, back on their own land, on the ridge overlooking their small, thriving ranch, they laid a fire under the brilliant bowl of the stars. She could have let the moment pass. She could have let their comfortable silence do the work. But she turned to Cale, the firelight dancing in her eyes, and said quietly, "I never asked you if you'd stay." He looked at her, as if she'd just asked him if the sky was blue. "I already did," he said. And that was it. That was their wedding. No rings, no chapel, no preacher. Just a promise whispered into the flames. From his lips, "I will walk beside you." And from hers, "I will never run from myself again." They didn't kiss under a shower of rose petals. They held hands in the snow. They said yes with their shoulders pressed close together and a child sleeping peacefully between them. Sometimes, in the years that followed, the boy, Elijah, would ask his mother why they didn't live in a town like other people. Mercy would smile and run a hand through his dark hair. Because towns have a way of forgetting the truth, she would say. Then Cale would lift the boy onto his broad shoulders and say, "But out here, son, we remember everything." Years later, people from other towns would sometimes talk about the strange ranch hidden deep in the mountains. They would talk about the woman who had disappeared and come back whole. They would talk about the silent Apache warrior who stood by her side. They would talk about the cabin that turned into a community and about the fire that never, ever went out. She was never a curse. She was just waiting for the right person to see that she was someone's miracle all along. If you enjoyed this story and you believe in the power of second chances, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me introduce you to the next miracle tomorrow. You won't want to miss it.